So the question I'm asking is, are we in the midst of a scientific revolution? Are we? Okay, good. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for your attention, and that'll be... No, okay. All right, we answered the question. IONS also loves science and non-duality, and we consider ourselves sister conferences, and we just really like participating in the Sane conference, and we hope that you'll all come to the Institute of Noetic Sciences conference next summer in Chicago. But I just want to say I'm really grateful to be here and grateful for Sane. So I was talking to the founder of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, the Apollo 14 astronaut Edgar Mitchell, about a year and a half ago. And how many of you in here are familiar with the Institute of Noetic Sciences? Okay, so our founder, as many of you know, Apollo 14 astronaut Edgar Mitchell, who was the 6th person to walk on the moon and is one of 8 surviving people who have been further from our planet than any other person in the history of humankind that we know of. So this is a unique perspective, and as many of you know, Edgar had a deep non-dual experience on his way back to Earth in the space capsule after his moonwalk, and that really influenced the rest of his life. And as he puts it, he came back from the program to explore outer space and launched a program to explore inner space. And that's what the Institute of Noetic Sciences has been doing for the last 40 years in a number of ways. You just got to hear, if you were here, how Dean Radin, our chief scientist, has been doing that in the laboratory. But I was talking to Edgar, and I said, "What's exciting you right now, Edgar? What are you working on?" And he said, "Well, we've learned that the universe is made of matter and energy. I think it's made of matter, energy, and consciousness. And I want to spend the rest of my life exploring this third force, or this third element." And that really sunk in deeply to me. I felt like, okay, that is such a simple and easy way of saying, what is the next phase in science? And it is this radical idea that it's not just matter and energy, that consciousness isn't just a byproduct of matter and energy, but that it may actually be its own equally important force that we've just barely begun to scratch the surface of learning more about with science. And so when I talk about consciousness, what I mean is that consciousness may be this force or this element or property of the universe that we know has an influence on our own bodies. We know that what you think, and when you're exposed to certain imagery or even thought processes, it changes your hormones, it changes your brain functioning over time with repeated attentional effort. It changes the structure of your brain, it changes your gene expression. So we know that consciousness has an effect on our own bodies. We also have this enticing evidence now, and Dean probably shared a little bit of this earlier, that consciousness might not just have an effect on our own body, it may stretch beyond our body and have an effect on other people, not just through our behaviors or our facial expressions or our tone of voice, but literally on other people, even at a distance, even when that person doesn't know that attention is being paid to them. Not only that, we think that it's possible, and we have evidence to suggest that consciousness might affect physical reality, both locally and at a distance. So when I'm talking about consciousness, I'm not just talking about being awake and aware, although that's part of it, that's like the tip of the iceberg. This is sort of the Jungian idea of consciousness, where underneath the surface there's a ground of shared being that mystics have described for millennia having experienced, and probably every one of you in this room has experienced to one extent or another something like knowing who was on the phone when the phone rang, or knowing that somebody was staring at you and feeling it and turning around to see that it was true, or having some sense of some knowledge that came from somewhere other than the 5 senses. These are all these clues that perhaps consciousness is not just locked into these individual bodies or in these individual skulls, but there's an aspect of it that reaches beyond our individual selves. So this is what we mean by the non-locality of consciousness. And this is the scientific revolution that I'm wondering whether is happening right now. There's this interconnected aspect that people subjectively experience and that we're starting to be able to observe more and more frequently objectively in the lab. Okay, so let's put that aside for a moment. We're going to use this as an example, but every year I make it a practice to reread The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Kuhn. Most of you are probably familiar with this. This was someone who in 1962 wrote this book and had looked at the previous massive scientific revolutions that took place in society and what were the factors that were always involved when a revolution happened and what were the stages, what were the common elements. And so this is a little cartoon that I got from the internet. It starts up here with normal science, which is just the existing paradigm. What happens next is that something drifts the model. There's some kind of anomalies that are observed or things that don't fit the model, and it starts to loosen it up. More and more of those are observed, and then the model comes into crisis. And at that point, there's a struggle between the old paradigm and the new paradigm. And then there can be just a dismissal of the new as a big mistake, or it can actually take precedence over the old paradigm and have a revolution, paradigm change, and then that new paradigm becomes the normal science. This is the way of thinking about it. So in what Kuhn calls normal science, fundamentals are rarely questioned. So there's lots and lots of questions being asked about the nature of reality, but you're not allowed to question the fundamental assumptions of the paradigm. Kuhn says it's an attempt to force nature into the preformed and relatively inflexible box that the paradigm supplies. Poor little guy. Kuhn says that at this stage, science is really about puzzle solving. So it's all going toward one solution, but the experiments have to be in a way predetermined. And if you've ever been somebody who wrote grant proposals for NSF or NIH, you know that even though you're scored on innovation and creativity, you're also going to be taken down a peg for too much creativity and innovation. Anything that goes too far out of the box is not involved in the approved puzzle solving range. And what happens is that failure to achieve the expected solutions to the puzzle discredits the scientist rather than damaging the theory. Now this is good, right? I mean, we want to have theories and paradigms be solid enough to be able to withstand some alterations from them without us changing it every single minute. But there is a problem here, as you can probably imagine, which is that any attempt to move into a new or expanded understanding is thwarted. So anomalies are really the key to starting to loosen the existing paradigm. In the beginning, anomalies simply are not noticed. It's kind of an inattentional blindness. They come up and if we notice them at all, we just say, well, let's cut off the top and the bottom to get rid of the noise and look at what's in our expected range. They're discarded, they're ignored. No effort is made to alter theory and very little tolerance for those who try. So this is a story from some friends of mine who were at a distant healing meeting at the National Institutes of Health, and they spent all day describing some of the evidence that supported the idea that healing could occur at a distance through intention alone. And at the end of the day, the head of the institute said, well, I'm not convinced. And one of the scientists said, well, what data would convince you? And he said, there are no data that would convince me. Right? So this is what we're facing when we talk about brand new ideas. This is one of my other favorites. I think it's attributed to Polly. I wouldn't believe it even if it were true. And then the best one is, that's so wrong, it's not even wrong. Yet these anomalies continue to pop their little heads up, and they can be these little irritable creatures to the existing paradigm. Counter instances continue to be observed, and at some point, as anomalies mount, pre-paradigmatic schools are formed. So this is before they really grow into normal science, but they start to create their own journals and their own societies, their secret meetings, their conferences, mostly with everybody believing this, talking to themselves, not yet with outside or, mainstream people coming in. This approaches the crisis moment. There's a persistent failure of the puzzles of normal science to be solved. Scientists start to express discontent, not just the ones who are very, very interested in the topic, but a little bit further out. They start to go, wait, this doesn't seem to be working. And competing paradigms begin to proliferate. So in response to the crisis, typically an existing paradigm doesn't renounce itself. It starts to make ad hoc modifications and say, well, under these certain circumstances, that might happen. Or, it starts to sort of add on, like if you've ever seen a house where people randomly added on rooms and it starts to look kind of weird, the paradigm has to get a little bit stretched there. And there are only three ways that the crisis can be resolved in this thinking. One is that the new theory is defeated, whether or not it's true, it's defeated, and things return to normal. Second, the anomalies are noted, but they're assumed to be explainable using the current paradigm and tools, and they're put on the shelf until we create better tools to explain it. This is kind of like where the observer effect is now in the minds of most physicists. Yes, there is a quantum measurement problem, but I'm sure we'll solve it once we get the right tools. It's nothing spooky. Third is that the new paradigm actually wins. It emerges, a battle ensues. The problem with the battle between a new paradigm and an old paradigm is that it can continue for many, many, many decades, and it's often circular and non-productive because each of the two sides are arguing from their reality. They're not even sharing the same language or premises. The way that Kuhn sees this happening in the past is that a successful new paradigm can eventually replace the old one or displace it, but it has to show that the two are logically incompatible. And one more factor about these paradigm shifts is that they're typically invisible and they're also erased in retrospect. So when Kuhn wrote this book, it was 1962, and he noticed how even though actual paradigm shift was pretty messy, the textbooks would make it look like, and then this happened, and then someone made this discovery, and then this happened, and then that happened, and it was all a completely reasonable linear process because we're scientists. In fact, these revolutions were way messier, and so they were rewritten in retrospect. It was also invisible while it was happening, so people didn't really know they were in it at the time. And so I asked the question, are we in a revolution? What I'm really interested in talking about and hope to have a little bit of audience discussion is how might non-duality inform the current scientific revolution we're in? So I would say yes. The current paradigm is entrenched. We could call this materialism. We're observing anomalies consistently. We've formed this pre-paradigmatic school because we're all here talking to each other about this. There's increasing resistance and dismissal. Some of you are very familiar with the TED problem and the Wikipedia censorship of all these ideas about consciousness. Yet more prominent people are coming out every day in support. And if you haven't read the recent article by Michael Shermer in Scientific American, you might find it interesting. This is someone who has made a career of being a skeptic. And he just 2 weeks ago wrote an article, and I honor him for this, saying, you know what, I just had this experience that shook my skepticism to the core. And it was something like his wife's father passed away. They went to the funeral. They came home. They start hearing this music play. They look all over for it, and they find in the back of a drawer a transistor radio that the father had owned that turned itself on. And so he just was like, okay, done. Something is going on here, right? So this is happening in many different areas. I think we're about here, somewhere near the crisis. And so what can non-duality offer to navigating the current shift that we're in? How could we maybe make it not be decades and decades of circular, unproductive arguing? And I mean non-duality as a concept, and I also mean it as a practice, because it's really helping me in my role at the Institute of Noetic Sciences not be arguing all the time. My own practice of non-dual awareness. The first is to stay centered and awake and be willing to hold the possibility of two logically incompatible things being true at the same time. This, for me, is an excellent non-dual practice. It's possible that consciousness arises from the brain. It's possible that the brain arises from consciousness. It's possible that both are true. It's possible that neither are true. Just being in that place of possibility opens the door for me to have open, curious conversations with people who have different perspectives, as opposed to feeling defensive or condescending. Thank you. It's also possible that the kind of scientific revolution we're in right now may not end up being an either-or proposition. It may be that the discoveries we make are not cumulative, they're not just building up, but that you can expand our current worldview to include the old paradigm and the new one, which requires that you allow for some paradox. It's possible that this revolution will be nonlinear, but instead be more of an alchemical process where the old paradigm and the new can blend in some way. It's also true that this issue with the textbooks rewriting history and the slowness of a new paradigm to take shape might not be true in our world. Because of the internet, the media, there's a dynamic flow of information right now through open science, through open access publication that has essentially eliminated the textbook problem. So it may not be that we're going to go step by step by step until one paradigm replaces another, but instead we're going to have this very dynamic, interesting blend of paradigms as we find our way. So as I was saying earlier, it's helpful for me to try to stay out of the argument. One of the metaphors I use when I'm teaching meditation to students when I'm researching the effects of meditation is, you know, you could go to the beach and the waves are coming in and you could decide, I want this to be calm, so I'm going to fight the waves. I'm going to keep fighting, 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 and you could fight for the rest of your life and the waves will continue to come in. What you could do instead is learn to surf the waves. And so this surfing metaphor helps too when I'm working through issues that come up in terms of being maybe criticized for the work we do or having what I think are unfair, comments, or trying to get something published and feeling like the goalposts change because of the topics we're studying. Just surfing those waves and staying curious, and rather than defending and getting away from, approaching and saying, let's talk more about this. I want to hear why you think that. I want to hear exactly how you think. Wilber is a developmental psychologist that many of you know. He's got this great idea that the stages of human development aren't one to another. It's not a ladder that you climb up, but that every new stage you transcend the current stage, but you also include it. So it's not getting rid of the stage you're in, it's transcend and include the previous stages. So again, this idea that consciousness might be a third force that really warrants a large degree of curiosity and exploration. I like to use the metaphor of electricity, that before electricity was discovered, it existed for millennia. And now it's something that lights and heats all of our houses after only 400 years of being uncovered. It may be that consciousness is similar to electricity, that it's been here the whole time as an active force, but we just hadn't known how to investigate it or how to harness it for well-being. So you can come to our panel at 11:30, where I have a stellar group of scientists who are investigating this idea of this new paradigm of non-local consciousness. But I think now we have about 5 minutes just for conversation. Thanks for listening.
First one.
My question is that quantum mechanics is showing us that we're dealing with the nonlinear system. At the same time, we are trying to explain this nonlinear system through our linear left side brain, logical brain. Isn't it a time, at the same time, other nonlinear theories, like quantum mechanics, system theory, networking theory, and fractal and all this, are giving us enough understanding of how the nonlinear system behaves. And through that, we can find out a new logic to explain these things. So don't you think that now we are at the age of, at the same time, the left side brain, or a linear side science, is explaining nonlinear science, so they are emerging together to give us a very clear and simple understanding of the whole universe. We just wanted to share this with you.
Thank you. I think that's beautiful. Yeah, that's what the Institute of Noetic Sciences is all about. And the word noetic means inner knowing. Science means outer observational knowing. And all of our work is about bridging and combining the two to reach new understandings. And so I completely agree.
Yep, there we go. Since science is so attached to cause and effect, and we're moving into a time of consciousness being the primary reality, what are we going to do with cause and effect? Do you have any ideas about doing away with the singularity of cause and effect in science and going someplace else, perhaps to the patterns arising out of being without cause and effect relationships?
Well, I think I'm a psychologist, and most of the people I work with are social scientists, and I think this is also true quite often in biology as well. When you move away from basic physics, almost everything else is correlation and deduction. So you may compile a lot of evidence showing that support your idea that one thing is causing another, but it's very, very difficult to prove that one thing is causing another, even if they're very highly correlated, or when one thing happens, the next thing happens next. So other than a steel ball hitting the next steel ball and having it go, the vast majority of current science is based on correlation and probability rather than true cause and effect. So I don't think it's a problem.
One more question there. Here we go.
In the new paradigm, how do you imagine subjective being included? Because the existing paradigm is very quantitative, very mass-driven, but the subjective experience can hardly be very quantified. So how would you imagine the new paradigm? I don't think we have a new paradigm yet. We have lots of interesting hypotheses, but far from a theory. How do you imagine the theory emerge when you have to include the very qualitative, subjective, and hardly can be even expressed in words kind of a factor into the new paradigm?
Yeah, that's a great question. I know that many of us who are in this field believe that the new science has to be first person, second person, and third person. So first person describing what's happening to you, second person someone else observing what's happening, and third a more objective observation of what's happening, and that they must be combined to make sense. And a lot of the new fMRI data, for example, with brain, shows changes in brain when all kinds of stimuli are presented, or tasks, or different kinds of interventions. By itself, the fMRI data don't tell us much more than this particular section of the brain is using more energy than this section. If you were to combine that observation with what the person was actually saying was happening or reporting was happening at that time, maybe plus what one other person is observing, you could triangulate the truth of what's happening and not just solely rely on the third person data, which is limited. So I don't know if that answers your question. The other thing is that you've got to know that so much of science is still, so much of what's now called objective science is still subjective. So you've got a human being looking in a microscope, you've got somebody coloring the two panels to show what's happening, and so there always is some subjectivity in the observation. What science tries to do is eliminate subjective bias, not eliminate subjectivity. So that's an interesting idea, is how could we eliminate as much subjective bias as we can without eliminating subjectivity?
So can we do, last one super quickly.
Why is political, economic, and military power inversely related to awareness and consciousness?
Naughty boy.
That's a good question. Why is political, economic, and military power inversely related to consciousness? Okay, I'm going to send that out as the koan for the break. Thank you.